Some people had no idea who they were messing with until it was far too late. Welcome back, anointed ones. This is not just another message. This is a spiritual subpoena, a divine disclosure, a holy confirmation for those of you who have suffered in silence while being dishonored by people who had no idea what realm you actually rank in. If this word stirs something deep in your chest, comment 777 right now. That's not just engagement, that's alignment. To every soul who's sown into this channel through your super thanks, I see you. I bless you. Whether you've given in dollars or in digital amens, your support is not forgotten. It's kingdom seed, and the fruit of it is already multiplying in the unseen. Now, here's the part they didn't see coming. They weren't just gossiping about a nice person. They weren't just underestimating a quiet soul. They were launching attacks against a spiritual general whose authority was hidden in humility. And because they couldn't discern your covering, they confused your stillness for powerlessness. That was their first mistake. But something happened the moment they came for you. They activated a dimension they didn't even believe in. And the ripple effect? Oh, it's real. They're waking up disturbed, seeing your face in dreams they can't explain, experiencing chaos in places they once felt invincible. That's not paranoia, that's payment. This isn't revenge. This is revelation. And what's about to unfold will prove one thing. You never had to defend your title because heaven had already stamped your rank. So stay with me, because in the next few moments, we're going to uncover the true reason why their attempt to take you down ended up becoming your promotion in the spirit. You're not imagining this shift. You're not delusional for sensing divine movement after betrayal. You're not broken, you're backed. And the evidence is about to speak. Ready? Let's step into the courtroom of revelation. God's chosen ones, their attack. Unlock the truth about your rank. They thought your quiet meant you were disqualified, that your humility was a lack of rank, but they didn't understand. Heaven often wraps its generals in gentleness. You weren't silent because you were scared. You were silent because the king had not yet commanded you to speak. That stillness they mocked, it wasn't passivity, it was divine restraint. You didn't respond when they slandered you. You didn't expose them when they lied. You didn't retaliate when they tried to humiliate you, and to the untrained eye, it looked like weakness. But have they ever seen a thunderstorm holding back behind the clouds? Power doesn't always present itself with noise. It often waits for timing. What if your lack of reaction was actually your clearest answer? And what if heaven was measuring their hearts by how they treated someone it had secretly crowned? When Jesus stood before Pilate and refused to defend himself, Matthew 27:14, it wasn't because he had nothing to say, it was because he was letting heaven speak. His silence was not surrender, it was strategy. That's the kind of power they couldn't interpret, and neither could those who underestimated you. You see, when ego is driving, people assume anyone who isn't shouting must be losing. But that's not how kingdom power works. Real authority doesn't advertise. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't compete for the spotlight. It simply holds space and shifts atmospheres without explanation. You didn't need to strike back because the fact that you endured without flinching was already a blow. Every time you chose dignity over drama, you delivered a warning they didn't hear. And when they crossed the line, thinking you were defenseless, something started shifting. Unexplainable disruptions, closed doors, broken partnerships, sleepless nights. Their world began unraveling, not because you cursed them, but because they cursed what was blessed. The laws of creation whisper this truth in silence. The jaguar does not growl to threaten. It moves in silence until it strikes. Bamboo can remain underground for years before growing skyward, and then, almost overnight, it shoots up several feet a day. That was you. Underground, overlooked, misread. But you were building root, not reputation, and when you rose, it was sudden, unstoppable. Psalm 37:6 declares, "He will bring forth your righteousness as the light and your justice as the noonday." God didn't need you to shout. He planned to reveal you in broad daylight. And now that moment has arrived. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor who quietly resisted Hitler's regime. He didn't scream in public squares. He wrote, he prayed, he sheltered the vulnerable. His humility was misread as irrelevance until his quiet resistance became a spiritual revolution that outlasted the Third Reich. But what happens when the proud mock what they don't recognize? What happens when people mistake consecration for cowardice and provoke heaven in the process? Take Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of Theranos. Promising miracles with blood tests, she presented confidence, control, and charisma. But it was noise without truth. Her arrogance masked fraud. And when the silence of evidence finally surfaced, the empire fell. Real power does not require illusion. It holds up under scrutiny. In a sleepy town in Oregon, a man named Callum ran a rescue shelter. He wore second-hand clothes, drove an old truck, and rarely spoke at meetings. But behind the scenes, he was feeding families, paying off strangers' hospital bills, and funding scholarships anonymously. A rival, thinking he was just another broke farmer, tried to publicly smear him, accusing him of misusing funds. But as the investigation unfolded, dozens of testimonials surfaced, receipts appeared, and city officials stepped in, not to arrest Callum, but to award him. The man who didn't speak had, all along, been the pillar of the town's survival. Your story isn't that different. You were judged by surface metrics, how loud you spoke, how much you posted, how visibly you flexed. And yet, all along your strength was rooted in how little you needed to. Because you had what they couldn't counterfeit, authority granted in secret places. Isaiah 30:15 says, "In quietness and in trust shall be your strength." You were quiet not because you lacked strength, but because that silence was your strength. You didn't react the way they wanted, and that was the reaction. You didn't perform for their audience, and that was your power. You didn't need the room's approval because heaven already voted yes. And when they kept pushing, thinking you'd eventually break, they collided with the truth. You weren't soft, you were shielded. You weren't absent, you were armed. Now they dream of you. They feel uneasy when your name comes up. Their peace evaporates, not because you haunted them, but because conviction does. Because once you've violated a divine boundary, your spirit knows it. You didn't act like a warrior because you didn't need to. You were one. The most dangerous ones don't need to prove it. They're already backed. Just like David, who said nothing when mocked by his own brothers, but took down Goliath in one throw, because his authority wasn't in his words. It was in his calling. And now, your calling speaks louder than anything you could have shouted. The ones who mistook your humility for weakness have discovered that the quiet ones, they're often the most dangerous, not because they are angry, but because they are anointed. They thought it was personal, a petty disagreement, a clash of opinions, a moment of friction they could control. But they were wrong, so dangerously wrong, because when they came for you, God's chosen one, they didn't just come for a personality, they came against a realm. They weren't poking a person, they were provoking a throne. You see, you are not merely someone with kindness and conviction. You are a vessel, a walking ordinance from heaven, a living blueprint encoded with divine frequency. That means when someone dares to dishonor you, they are not just disrespecting flesh, they are violating protocol in the spirit. They are breaching sacred law. And whether they realize it or not, that always initiates consequences. Not because you're vengeful, but because the kingdom is just. What if the gossip they whispered wasn't just drama, but the spiritual equivalent of shouting rebellion in heaven's court? What if the way they mishandled you triggered invisible judgments they'll spend years trying to reverse? Remember when Elisha was mocked by a gang of young men in 2 Kings 2:23-24? They called him bald head and laughed. But heaven didn't. Immediately, a divine consequence unfolded. Not because Elisha retaliated, but because the anointing on him demanded respect. The realm responded for him. That's the principle at work in your life. You didn't have to curse them. You didn't even have to speak. But heaven took notes. Angels logged the insult. And when you stayed quiet, the spiritual world did what your mouth never needed to. A hive doesn't retaliate because it feels petty. It retaliates because its queen is threatened. And when the queen carries the future of the colony, protection becomes instinctual. So it is with you. The divine realm has wrapped you in layers of invisible defense, not because you're fragile, but because your calling is fertile. You carry legacy, destiny, instruction, and anything that threatens that gets neutralized. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a man of peace, yet a lion in spirit. He didn't raise weapons in South Africa's darkest days. He raised his voice. And yet, for every time he was threatened or discredited, something higher protected him. Not because of his own strength, but because of the mission he carried. His presence irritated systems because his very existence was a rebuke to darkness. Now contrast that with a man like Martin Shkreli, the former pharmaceutical executive widely known as Pharma Bro. Introduced as a financial prodigy, he gained fame for inflating the price of a life-saving drug from $13.50 to $750 per pill overnight. His decisions weren't just cold, they were cruel. He smirked in congressional hearings, dismissed public outcry, and mocked the suffering of others. But eventually, judgment caught up. Not only was he sentenced to prison for securities fraud, but his name became synonymous with greed. Power rooted in ego always decays. Because when you use your influence to manipulate instead of to serve, the realm will respond, not with thunder, but with unraveling. In the village of Marenbrook, a teacher named Sella worked quietly for years, nurturing orphans and tutoring children forgotten by the system. No one knew she'd once been assigned to a divine mission through a dream where she saw her hands glowing as she taught. But when a new administrator tried to remove her out of jealousy, strange things began to happen. Records went missing. The school's funding was frozen. Every attempt to push her out failed. Eventually, the administrator stepped down, not out of guilt but exhaustion. They never realized they weren't fighting a teacher. They were challenging a realm. You, chosen one, carry this same pattern. You've been mislabeled as too sensitive or overreacting, when in reality, the realm backing you has simply been responding to dishonor. When the shift hits their life, when confusion clouds their plans, when opportunities dry up, when friendships suddenly vanish, they may call it coincidence. But the Spirit knows better. Exodus 14:14 declares, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." That stillness wasn't weakness. It was your signal. You didn't lift a finger, but heaven did, because heaven never allows its emissaries to be attacked without response. And again, in Psalm 105, verse 15, the command is clear. "Do not touch my anointed ones and do my prophets no harm." They weren't just being rude, they were trespassing against sacred territory. They were treating a divine assignment like a disposable pawn, and now they're learning the hard way. You don't get to play games with God's strategy. What if they thought it was just a comment, just a lie, just a plan? But in truth, it was a challenge to heaven itself. And what if you, walking quietly, simply became the mirror that exposed their rebellion? Real authority doesn't threaten. It doesn't posture. It doesn't even need to retaliate. It just is. It exists with a spiritual gravity that distorts everything that tries to come against it. And that's what's happening now. Their plans are bending under weight they can't explain. Not because you're powerful in yourself, but because the realm that sent you never loses a war. They didn't just pick a fight with you. They picked a fight with your sender. And that test, it always ends in judgment. There's something about you they can't quite explain, but it unsettles them. They can imitate your style, mirror your words, even pretend to carry your grace. But what they can't fabricate is spiritual clearance. It's not something you earned in a classroom or unlocked through networking. It's something heaven encoded into your being long before you drew your first breath. Jeremiah 1:5 says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart." That was your spiritual assignment being stamped with a seal, unseen by man, but recognized by realms. They thought they could study you and gain what you had, but they were never cleared for the corridors you walk in. They didn't understand that what you carry isn't just favor, it's authorization, a divine access pass. And when unauthorized hands reach into sealed territory, consequences follow. Not because you defended yourself, but because heaven did. What if their confusion about your peace wasn't just envy, but recognition that you've touched realms they'll never access? What if your calm was confirmation that you operate under a level of backing they never believed was real? Your silence wasn't passivity, it was protocol. You didn't need to defend your space, because that space was already patrolled. When they tried to insert themselves into your life with manipulation, jealousy, or control, they didn't just cross a boundary, they violated an ordinance. In Acts 19:13-16, the 7 sons of Sceva attempted to cast out demons using the name of Jesus, yet had no relationship with the power behind that name. The result? They were attacked and fled wounded and naked. Why? Because access without authority always ends in exposure. And that's what happened to those who tried to enter your realm without clearance. They got spiritually stripped. Not every bird can fly into certain altitudes. The eagle alone can soar above storms because of how its lungs and wings are designed. And just like the eagle, your spiritual design allows you to operate where others suffocate. They didn't understand that. So they tried to fly where they couldn't breathe, and now they're gasping. Dr. Miles Monroe, a Bahamian leadership teacher and preacher, once said, "True authority is not in position, but in permission. You carry what's been permitted by heaven, not self-appointed." And that's what confounds them. They can't compete with something God handcrafted. Meanwhile, their testing of you has flipped. The ones who thought they were evaluating your worth are now being evaluated by the realm they mocked. One by one, their peace is disturbed. Their plans crumble. Their influence fades. Not because you prayed against them, but because they trespassed into sacred zones. They violated a spiritual firewall. Contrast that with Anna Delvey, a con artist who posed as a German heiress to infiltrate New York's elite. Her charm, her flair, her access, all fabricated. For a while, it worked, but eventually, truth surfaced. And when it did, doors slammed shut. Because while charisma may get you in the room, only true clearance keeps you there. In the countryside of Iberia, a man named Tiago was known for his simplicity. He never asked for platforms, never self-promoted, but wherever he walked, things aligned. Weather shifted, crops thrived, feuds ended. People laughed at first, then started whispering. What they didn't realize was that in secret, he'd spent decades in communion with God. One day, a mayor tried to recruit him to manipulate local politics. Tiago said nothing. Days later, the mayor fell ill, strangely only regaining strength after publicly apologizing. No one called it magic, but everyone sensed the truth. Tiago carried something not of this world. You, chosen one, are not a regular presence. That's why regular logic fails to explain your outcomes. Your victories defy natural cause and effect. Why? Because you're not just walking through life. You're enforcing something holy. And when doors open for you that others can't budge, when favor tracks you down across continents, when your name precedes you into places you've never visited, that's not luck, that's clearance. They're haunted now, not by anything you did, but by everything they now understand. You weren't random, you weren't weak, you weren't easy to replace, you were sealed, and they weren't cleared to even speak your name with casual intent. Isn't it wild how your stillness caused more disruption than their schemes ever could? Could it be that your very existence is a mirror revealing everything they tried to hide from themselves? Isaiah 22:22 says, "I will place on his shoulder the key to the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open." That's you, a walking key, a living gate. So while they scrambled to figure you out, the realm already moved on your behalf. Because divine clearance cannot be earned by ambition, it's only given by assignment, and yours is still active, which means their access remains. Denied. They mocked what they could see because they had no access to what they couldn't. They stared at your clothes, your tone, your background, your bank account, your accent, and assumed they had you figured out. In their world, packaging means power. But in the kingdom, power hides in unexpected vessels. And you, chosen one, were a divine contradiction to everything they thought they understood. They thought they were looking at someone small, but they didn't realize they were staring at a key that unlocks realms. They judged the outer form while being completely blind to the internal fire. How can someone who wears no crown in the natural carry royal command in the spirit? That question never crossed their mind because they never trained their spirit to ask it. 1 Samuel 16:7 reminds us, "People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." They saw David as a shepherd, but heaven saw a king. You too were dismissed for being too quiet, too raw, too real, too unpolished. But your calling was never about performance, it was about purpose. They thought you came to impress them, but you were sent to disrupt them. You weren't meant to fit their mold, you were designed to expose the mold. Every system built on ego, every mask of spiritual performance, every illusion of control, your very presence began to crack it. What if your authenticity was the earthquake to their illusion? What if their rejection was really just a response to their inability to dominate you? They mocked your gentleness, but now they flinch in the silence. They scoffed at your journey, but now they're imitating your rhythm behind closed doors. You didn't change to prove anything, but your consistency proved everything. Even Jesus was mocked in his vessel. "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" John 1:46, they asked. As if divine assignments require glamorous geography, they crucified the king because his crown was hidden beneath wounds. That pattern hasn't changed. People still mock what heaven calls sacred simply because it doesn't look familiar. Even in nature, some of the most potent remedies grow from unremarkable soil. The lowly dandelion, often seen as a weed, holds healing properties that pharmaceuticals try to replicate. Power isn't always beautiful. Sometimes it's rooted. Take Viola Davis, Academy Award-winning actress. Before the spotlight, she was raised in poverty, often mocked for her appearance and skin tone, but she stayed rooted in purpose. Today, she's not just respected for her craft, but for her weight, her substance, her unshakable authenticity. She didn't dress her gift in performance, she dressed it in truth. But let's not forget those on the other end. Billy McFarland, the creator of the infamous Fire Festival, dressed himself in wealth, luxury, and fabricated fame. He mocked authenticity, glorified illusion, and it all collapsed. Lawsuits followed. His reputation imploded because, in the long run, performance always shatters under pressure. In the town of Ambronia, a woman named Ziva ran a quiet market stall. Every morning she prayed before selling anything. customers mocked her for blessing fruit instead of advertising it. But week after week, people kept returning. Not because she had the cheapest prices, but because what she carried brought peace. When a group of investors tried to take over the stall location for a flashy tourist market, power outages began plaguing their operations. They called in engineers, but one finally whispered, "You might have removed her, but you didn't remove the favor." Months later, they invited her back, not out of sympathy, but necessity. "You, chosen one, were not sent here for applause. You were sent as a plow, to break fallow ground, to challenge systems, to walk into rooms and disturb the rhythm of control and imitation. And because your vessel didn't look like what they expected, they mocked you. But now they're afraid. The stillness that once offended them now convicts them. The peace they ridiculed now torments their restless nights. The voice they laughed at now echoes in rooms they don't belong in. Could it be that the very things they dismissed were the signs they should have discerned? Isn't it wild that your presence, once rejected, has now become the blueprint they secretly study? You never forced validation. You bore fruit. You never chased spotlight. You carried weight. And over time, the essence exposed what the image never could. They mocked the vessel, but heaven crowned it. They tried to discredit what they couldn't define. And now they realize the most dangerous vessels often come unannounced. You moved in silence. For years they overlooked you because you didn't announce yourself. You walked through storms without explaining the weather. You kept your head down, not out of fear, but out of faithfulness. You healed in private. You obeyed in secret. You grew in places no one was clapping. And while the world saw an ordinary figure, heaven was recording the birth of a warrior. They didn't know your hidden years were holy years. They assumed your anonymity meant you lacked impact. But heaven had already stamped your identity before your enemies even learned your name. You were known where it mattered most. The throne recognized your yes. But here's what they never anticipated, that by testing you, they would activate something in the spirit realm that could never be undone. What if their attack was the spark that lit the battlefield? What if the insult they threw was actually the key that unlocked your public authority? In Job 1:8-12, Satan didn't go after just anyone. He went after Job because God himself acknowledged Job's spiritual authority before the courts of heaven. "Have you considered my servant Job?" And once the battle was approved, hell trembled at what it accidentally helped reveal. That's what's happening now. Your trial was your unveiling. You didn't clap back. You didn't curse them, but your ability to withstand the fire without turning to ash, that was a language the realm of darkness could no longer ignore. Your name, once whispered in confusion, is now echoing in both realms. Heaven rejoices. Hell panics. Volcanic islands form under pressure. They remain unseen for years, building quietly under the ocean's floor, until one tremor shifts everything. Then they emerge, unmovable and crowned with fire. You are that island. You were never fragile. You were just forming. Now, let's make it plain. Corrie 10. Boom, a watchmaker from the Netherlands, was dismissed by many as just another woman, until she started hiding Jews from the Nazis during the Holocaust. She was arrested, tortured, and yet survived. Her faith became her weapon. After the war, she forgave her captors and preached hope globally. Hell feared her, not because she shouted, but because she endured. Now contrast her with Adam Neumann, the co-founder of WeWork. Introduced as a visionary entrepreneur, he promised to elevate the world's consciousness through office spaces. Charismatic, loud, and backed by billions. He built a brand on energy and image. But behind the scenes, chaos, mismanagement, a cult of personality. He mocked accountability, glorified control, and inflated value with illusion. Eventually, WeWork collapsed in one of the most spectacular corporate downfalls in recent memory. Why? Because when ambition tries to impersonate divine purpose, it always fractures under pressure. Hell doesn't tremble at hype, it trembles at holiness. And Adam never carried the real weight. In a hidden monastery in southern France, a boy named Lucien swept floors for 10 years. No one thought much of him. He was mute, orphaned, and slow to speak. But every time he prayed, the atmosphere changed. Flowers bloomed in dead soil. Broken horses calmed. People began seeking him out for silence more than sermons. Until one day, a local governor tried to exploit his mystery for political gain. Lucien simply walked away. Within a week, the governor's mansion flooded. Without rain, no one could explain it. But the locals whispered, heaven had marked the boy, now hell knows him too. Your journey mirrors this pattern. You were once just a possibility. Now you are a problem. You were once a whisper in someone's gossip. Now you're thunder in the spirit realm. You didn't break when they pushed. You didn't flinch when they tested. And because you didn't fold, now they know. They touched someone they were never cleared to handle. Isn't it something that your silence triggered more fear than their noise ever commanded? Could it be that your restraint exposed a realm of power they never believed was real, until it started dismantling their plans? Luke 10:19 says, I have given you authority to overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you. That authority didn't begin when they attacked. It was activated because you endured. And now, you're not just someone God knows. You're someone hell fears. You're not just covered, you're commissioned. The warfare is louder because the threat is confirmed. Your very presence irritates systems of manipulation, spirits of deceit, networks of counterfeit authority. Why? Because you didn't fake your oil. You paid for it. So yes, you were hidden, but you weren't hiding. You were reserved, protected. And now the realms have shifted. Your unveiling is complete. The light has recognized you, and so has the darkness. One celebrates, the other trembles. They didn't realize what they were doing when they came for you. To them, it was just cruelty, just manipulation, just petty sabotage. But to heaven, it was a divine examination. They thought they were breaking you, but they were unknowingly participating in your proving. Every setup, every slander, every whisper behind your back, it wasn't just persecution, it was permission for your promotion. What if every trap was secretly a doorway? What if the battlefield was never about pain, but about proof? In Genesis 50:20, Joseph tells his brothers, You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. That wasn't just redemption, it was revelation. Joseph wasn't just surviving his betrayal, he was passing exams designed to position him. So were you. They tried to humiliate you publicly, but every time you chose dignity over drama, heaven recorded it. They cursed your name, but you blessed your process. And while they laughed behind closed doors, angels were taking notes. They thought you were losing your grip, but you were gaining clearance. You weren't being dismantled, you were being developed. The betrayal was a test of your loyalty to truth. The rejection was a test of your identity. Would you forget who you are just to feel included? And the silence, the eerie stillness after they walked away, that was the exam room. You were never alone. You were under observation. In the natural world, diamonds are formed under relentless pressure, but before they're used, they're examined under magnification. Why? To verify that pressure didn't crack them. Heaven did the same with you. Not to see if you were shiny, but to see if you were solid. Take Nelson Mandela, thrown in prison for 27 years. They tried to destroy his body, his spirit, his name. But what they didn't know was that every passing day in that cell was proving him to heaven and history. His endurance, his refusal to hate, his clarity of vision, all became the very credentials for his assignment. They attacked him like he was disposable, but it turned out they were verifying a king, Now contrast that with Jordan Belfort, the self-styled Wolf of Wall Street. He lived fast, built quickly, mocked authority, and fell even harder. His life was filled with signs he refused to heed. Every lawsuit, every ruined relationship, every failed cover-up was an exam he cheated on until the final test stripped everything. Because when character is absent, the storm is always fatal. In the city of Narvik, a woman named Anina worked as a hospital cleaner. Every time a patient died alone, she stayed behind to whisper prayers no one asked for. No one saw her sacrifices, until one day, a surgeon accused her of stealing. She said nothing, but when security footage cleared her name, the hospital board also discovered she'd been anonymously donating blood for 10 years, enough to save 300 lives. What was meant to shame her elevated her instead. The attacker gave her a platform. Her purity did the rest. They didn't know, chosen one, that your silence was strategy, that your tears were not wasted, they were counted. Psalm 56:8 says, "You keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle." Your pain was data in heaven's court. Your response was evidence. And your restraint? That was the proof of spiritual rank. You didn't retaliate. You didn't fall apart. You passed. Not with ease, but with excellence. Not because it didn't hurt, but because you refused to hand them your identity in exchange for temporary satisfaction. That's spiritual maturity. And now, the very people who mocked your breakdown are watching your breakthrough. What they meant as your funeral became your formation. Your endurance didn't just shock them, it unsettled realms. Because now it's undeniable. They gave you their worst, and you still didn't fold. Could it be that your scars were not signs of defeat, but stamps of divine qualification? Isn't it wild that the very ones who tried to test your spirit now fear the strength they accidentally revealed? Heaven didn't need you to shout. You proved it in the quiet. You passed in the pain. You succeeded without ceremony. And now that the smoke has cleared, your testimony stands, not as survival, but as sacred distinction. They didn't realize they were setting up the stage for a version of you that hell can't handle. They gave you exams. You gave heaven evidence, and that's what haunts them now. They didn't see you coming, not because you were hiding, but because their eyes were never trained to recognize true power when it comes wrapped in humility. They weren't foolish in the world's eyes. Many of them were articulate, respected, well-dressed, clever in conversation. But intelligence without spiritual depth is like a compass with no magnet, spinning but directionless. They didn't underestimate you because they lacked intellect. They underestimated you because they had never been initiated into spiritual things. And what the uninitiated don't understand, they mock. What they can't label, they discredit. What they can't control, they try to diminish. Not because you were offensive, but because your authenticity offended their illusions. Could it be that your peace disrupted what their pride had protected? Isn't it wild that your quiet truth was louder than all their noise? You didn't have to quote scripture. Your stillness spoke louder than sermons. Your boundaries exposed their chaos, and your presence, unshaken, unperformed, became a mirror to their own spiritual delay. You didn't show up to prove anything. You showed up clothed in what they had never seen before: refined obedience, silent fire. 1 Corinthians 2:14 says, "The natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him." That's why they thought you were weird, too deep, too intense, too sensitive. But heaven never sent you to be palatable. You were sent to be precise. They couldn't recognize you because your credentials weren't printed on paper. They were carved through pain, through nights soaked in prayer, through fire that didn't destroy you, but forged you. You earned rank in silence, not by seeking stages, but by surviving shadows. Even Jesus, standing in his own hometown, was underestimated. "Isn't this the carpenter's son?" they asked in Matthew 13:55. And they took offense at him. Why? Because the spiritual rank he carried made no sense to their natural minds. It still doesn't. In nature, the most venomous snakes don't hiss before they strike. The stillest waters often hide the deepest currents. You were still, but you were never shallow. They couldn't see your depth because they never had to build their own. You didn't talk much. But when you did, the atmosphere shifted. That wasn't personality, that was placement. Malala Yousafzai, a young girl from Pakistan. The world underestimated her because she was quiet, feminine, and young. But her spirit had been forged through oppression, near death, and mission. She didn't scream her authority, she walked in it. And now her name is echoed across nations, not because she forced her way forward, but because her story carried weight that no culture could suppress. Now contrast that with Sam Bankman-Fried, hailed as a crypto genius running FTX. On the surface, brilliant, strategic, dominating headlines, but spiritually uninitiated. He played with trust like it was a toy. And when the structure collapsed, it wasn't just financial, it was moral. Because when spirit isn't forged, intellect becomes a weapon of self-destruction. In a remote village named Leora, a young woman named Irina was often laughed at for her simplicity. She read old prophetic scrolls and prayed for hours in fields. Locals said she was odd, but during a devastating drought, the land around her house remained green. Her well never dried. Scientists were called, no answers. A pastor visited. She said only, "The land remembers the ones who pray." Suddenly, those who mocked her began lining up, asking for her to bless their homes. You've lived this too. You weren't loud, but you carried volume. You weren't flashy, but your light couldn't be dimmed, and they couldn't comprehend you. Not because you were confusing, but because their spirits weren't mature enough to read the language of heaven that you spoke without words. What if your restraint was their revelation? What if you were never supposed to be understood, only discerned? They tried to fit you into categories their ego could manage, but you didn't belong in their system. You were never a subject in their classroom. You were the exam they failed. You didn't need approval. You had alignment. You weren't trying to be liked. You were trying to be loyal to the one who called you, forged you, and sent you. And because they hadn't passed through the kind of fire you've known, they couldn't see the authority you carried. Now it haunts them. The one they dismissed was the one sent to deliver. The one they called too much was carrying what they didn't have the depth to receive. And now they're realizing the quiet ones aren't weak. They're weaponized. You didn't show up with ego. You showed up with essence. And that's why heaven knows your name, and hell won't forget it. Isaiah 66:2 says, "These are the ones I look on with favor, those who are humble and contrite in spirit, and who tremble at my word." You weren't trying to be seen. You were simply walking in reverence. And that posture is what positioned you for everything that's unfolding now. They were waiting for the explosion, for you to clap back, retaliate, burn everything down. But instead, you chose something far more dangerous. You chose to survive. And survival, when done in silence and rooted in truth, becomes the loudest judgment of all. You didn't drag their name. You didn't expose their schemes. You didn't match their cruelty. You simply walked forward, bruised maybe, shaken, yes, but broken, never. And now that quiet decision, that refusal to be baited, is what haunts them most. You didn't curse them, but your peace did. Your joy became the evidence. Your glow became the consequence. Isn't it wild how your silence became the courtroom? Could it be that your resilience preached a sermon their souls weren't ready to hear? Romans 12:19 says, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.'" You didn't have to repay anything, because heaven already scheduled the reckoning. Your only assignment was to endure, And you did. They wanted you to act out. They needed you to self-destruct so they could say, "See," told you they were unstable. But instead, you rested, you healed, you rose. And now they're faced with the uncomfortable truth. Their power was always imagined. The arrows they launched didn't pierce your purpose. They only punctured their own masks. Creation understands this rhythm instinctively. A tree struck by lightning doesn't shout back. It simply keeps growing, slowly, quietly, until its rings tell a story of storms survived. You are that tree, still rooted, still rising. Your growth is not vengeance, it's vindication. Look at Brandon Leake, a poet from a modest background who won America's Got Talent with spoken word, not with glitter, not with noise, but with vulnerability and truth. Growing up, he was mocked for being too soft, too emotional. He didn't curse the doubters. He turned pain into poetry, and his survival of ridicule, of grief, of rejection, that became the very light that elevated him to a national platform. His presence testified without performance. Now contrast that with Lori Loughlin, once known as a beloved television actress and role model. She played wholesome characters, wore the image of moral perfection, but behind the scenes, she was involved in one of the biggest college admissions scandals in US history, paying for her children to secure spots through bribery. It wasn't public enemies who brought her down. It was exposure. Quiet, surgical, spiritual exposure. Her career didn't end with a curse. It ended with headlines, handcuffs, and the loss of public trust. Because when someone builds their future on false favor, time eventually lifts the curtain. And heaven doesn't need noise to make correction. It simply lets the fruit rot in the light. In a village near the Baltic Sea, a young man named Joran was wrongly accused of embezzling funds from a community charity. He was shunned, lied about, publicly humiliated, but he didn't defend himself. He spent the next year quietly working nights at a remote greenhouse. Months later, the real culprit confessed, unprovoked. When investigators traced the timeline, they discovered Joran had been using his paychecks to cover the charity's shortfall, anonymously. The town fell silent. No applause was needed. His fruit spoke for itself. You, chosen one, are walking this same path. You've mastered the rarest language, restraint. The world teaches revenge, but the Spirit teaches radiance. You didn't pray for their downfall. You prayed for your peace, and God answered with wholeness. Now, their shame is growing louder than their gossip ever was, because your life keeps shining, your fruit keeps multiplying, and it's revealing their lies in ways no argument ever could. Isaiah 54:17 declares, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue that rises against you in judgment you shall condemn." You didn't have to open your mouth. Your survival became the condemnation. Your joy became the verdict. They thought they were testing your limits, but they ended up testing divine boundaries. And now the backlash isn't emotional, it's spiritual. Dreams interrupted, peace disturbed, favor drained. Not because you hex them, but because truth has a frequency, and yours is thundering. What if survival was your sharpest weapon? What if your wholeness is the justice they never expected? You didn't curse them, you just didn't die. And for someone like you, that's all it takes to change the atmosphere. They didn't want your smile, they didn't want your personality. What they craved, what they envied, was your spiritual substance. The weight you carry without saying a word, the atmosphere that shifts when you enter a room. The oil on your life that makes dry places bloom and darkness back up. But here's what they didn't understand. You didn't find that power in a book or borrow it from a mentor. You were forged in fire, and that anointing came with blood. What if the thing they were mocking was actually the mantle they were trying to counterfeit? What if their obsession with you wasn't about attention, it was about unauthorized access? They wanted the influence without the breaking, the visibility without the valley. They wanted the crown but refused the crucifixion. But spiritual weight cannot be pirated. It must be pressed. Your rank didn't come easy. You didn't manifest it in a moment of bliss. You bled for it, obedience in private, suffering in silence, saying yes to God when every cell in your body was begging you to run. Your oil was extracted, not gifted. In 2 Samuel 6:7, Uzzah touched the Ark of the Covenant without being sanctified, and he died on the spot. Why? Because no matter how noble the gesture, touching the sacred without preparation is still trespassing. That's what they did when they tried to imitate you. They stepped into frequencies their spirit wasn't designed to hold. And the realm responded. They wore your words, mimicked your mannerisms, and even tried to walk in your assignments. But heaven knows whose tears paid for what. The oil on your life can't be cloned, because God doesn't anoint performance. He anoints process. The design of creation honors this law without debate. The baobab tree survives harsh seasons by storing water deep within its core. On the outside it looks bloated, strange, even mocked. But when famine comes, every creature turns to it for sustenance. The weight you carry doesn't always look glamorous, but when the drought hits, it's the oil bearers who remain standing. Maya Angelou, whose voice was once stolen by trauma so deep she didn't speak for 5 years. They saw her poetry. They envied her platform, but few saw the price she paid in silence and survival. Her authority didn't come from exposure, it came from excavation, and every word she wrote carried a frequency they couldn't fake. But contrast that with Anna Sorokin, a con artist who posed as a German heiress, exploiting relationships to gain access to wealth and status she never earned. She copied culture, she mimicked wealth, she forged access. But when the truth caught up, the realm corrected itself. Not because someone cursed her, but because spiritual theft always ends in collapse. And no matter how polished the presentation, heaven knows when something's hollow. In the village of Theranova, a quiet woman named Elzara lived without platform or title, but everyone who came near her left different, not inspired, transformed. One day, a rising prophet tried to study under her, but he grew bitter when she wouldn't promote him. In secret, he began to preach her revelations. At first, people applauded him, but then things shifted. He started hearing voices. Dreams tormented him. His favor dried up. Years later, he confessed, "I was speaking words I hadn't survived, and the words turned on me." Some realms don't just require understanding, they demand initiation. You, chosen one, were initiated through affliction. That's why your presence convicts, not because you're loud, but because you're legal. The weight on your life is authorized. They didn't know that trying to imitate your spirit was spiritual perjury. They thought it was branding, but heaven saw it as blasphemy. Could it be that they triggered judgment not by cursing you, but by impersonating the journey you bled for? Isn't it wild that they tried to dethrone someone who was never seeking a throne, only serving an assignment? Isaiah 61:3 says, "To give them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness." You wear that oil now, not because of charm, but because of cost. Heaven honors authenticity, and authenticity is always born in pain. You never asked for their collapse, but the moment they tried to steal something sacred without paying the price, the realm answered. Not with thunder, but with disruption. Now their plans are unraveling, their peace is thinning, their shadows are speaking. And you're rising, not as revenge, but as revelation. A walking reminder that the oil can't be copied. It must be earned, in tears, in tests, in trenches. You weren't trying to be powerful, you were trying to survive. And somehow, survival became the loudest judgment of all. You didn't come adorned in gold. You didn't arrive with a trumpet announcing your entrance. There was no title, no royal entourage, no grand introduction. You came with something far heavier than a crown, an assignment. And that's why they overlooked you. They couldn't recognize purpose when it wasn't polished. They expected influence to come loud, but you came low. They expected status, but you came with substance. What they didn't realize is that heaven doesn't send celebrities, it sends servants. What if their disrespect was actually a response to your difference? What if they were never meant to recognize you, only to be reshaped by your presence? Philippians 2:7 says Jesus made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a servant. You too were assigned, not to be admired but to be aligned, to walk into chaos and quietly install divine order, to shift atmospheres, not through volume, but through vibration, the frequency of someone who's been through fire without smelling like smoke. That's why rooms changed when you entered, not because you spoke, but because your spirit registered. That's why some people felt agitated around you without knowing why. You were never aggressive, but your alignment exposed their disorder. You didn't train for this in stages. You were crushed for it in closets, in the silence, in the nights no one saw, in the hidden moments where you chose obedience over applause. That's where your anointing was carved. The tectonic plates beneath the earth shift in silence, yet birth earthquakes that reshape entire landscapes. You are that spiritual shift, unannounced but undeniable, a force that doesn't ask for attention but reorganizes the room. Look at Fred Rogers, the gentle children's television host, soft-spoken, unassuming, not the kind of man you'd expect to carry societal impact, yet his compassion, consistency, and quiet authority reshaped generations. He didn't preach, he embodied peace, and to this day, his legacy carries more weight than those who shouted for influence. Now contrast that with Dan Bilzerian, a man once seen as the image of success. Money, women, weapons, noise. He built a brand on performance, but when the facade cracked, lawsuits followed. Disillusionment set in. Why? Because you can borrow attention, but you can't fake authentic weight. In the mountains of Kalundborg, a woman named Aura was known only for tending her goats and humming prayers into the wind. But every time conflict arose in the village, leaders sought her counsel. They didn't know why. She didn't wear robes, didn't speak loudly, but peace followed her. Her presence pulled confusion into clarity. One day, a warlord mocked her and claimed her wisdom as superstition. Within a month, his alliances fractured. Crops failed, and his own men left him, not because she cursed him, but because he disrespected a force he didn't understand. Aura didn't wear a crown. She wore assignment. You, chosen one, move in the same mystery. Your assignment is not noisy, but it is nuclear. It doesn't come to impress. It comes to interrupt. You didn't show up to be feared, but fear followed because your spirit didn't bend. You didn't walk like a performer. You walked like someone who's died 1,000 quiet deaths and lived to carry truth. Isaiah 11:2 says, "The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord." That Spirit rests on you now, and it doesn't make you flashy, it makes you formidable. Could it be that the reason they couldn't define you was because heaven never sent you to be decoded, only discerned? Isn't it wild that while they were looking for crowns, they missed the one carrying the keys? You didn't come for applause, you came for alignment. You weren't chasing approval, you were installing heaven's blueprint. And now that the atmosphere has shifted, now that the ground has moved, they're beginning to realize you were never just another presence. You were an interruption, you were an instruction, you were never just a person, you were a response from heaven. They came with swagger, you came with scars. They came to dominate, you came to discern. And that's why the whole battlefield was tilted before they even raised a sword. They saw your calm, and thought it was weakness. They saw your silence and thought it was surrender, but only because they had no idea what kind of storms you've survived in the shadows. They didn't know that while they were gathering crowds, you were gathering strength. While they were learning how to perform, you were learning how to wrestle angels. Genesis 32:24 through 30 tells us that Jacob wrestled with a divine being through the night and came out limping, but transformed. He didn't win with perfection, he won through persistence. And so did you. What if the thing that made you quiet is the same thing that makes you untouchable? What if they mistook your stillness for softness, not realizing it came from sacred survival? You weren't shaped in the spotlight. You were shaped in seasons of silence so intense that even the sound of your own thoughts felt like war. And while they came mocking, manipulating, and testing, they didn't realize they were walking into sacred ground. You're not someone who flinches at noise. You've lived through deafening darkness and came back with flame in your eyes. That's what makes you dangerous. Not ego, but endurance. The elements themselves reveal this truth. The obsidian stone is formed in the aftermath of volcanic eruption. Black, dense, sharp. It's not polished by hand, but birthed through pressure. It looks still, but it's the residue of eruption. You are that. What they saw as quiet was just concentrated force. Look at Bethany Hamilton, a pro surfer who lost her arm in a shark attack at 13. The world wrote her off. But she didn't curse the waves, she returned to them. She didn't fight her battle in public. She healed, rebuilt, and competed again. Her comeback didn't require fury, it required fire. Not the kind that screams, but the kind that never dies. Now, contrast that with Ramesh Sunny Balwani, the former COO of Theranos. He stood beside a vision built on vapor, selling breakthrough promises in healthcare that never truly existed. He didn't endure pressure to birth truth. He orchestrated illusion to secure power. While real pioneers bled in silence, he projected confidence in rooms filled with deception. And when the truth emerged, he wasn't attacked. He unraveled. Because heaven doesn't need to shout to correct fraud. It just waits until the weight of falsehood collapses itself. In the ruins of Elaros, a city once split by tribal division, there lived a girl named Lyra. She was mute by choice, not because she couldn't speak, but because she had seen what words could destroy. As war raged, both sides mocked her silence, until one night a prophecy returned, handwritten in her childhood script. Her silence had been sacred listening, her vision accurate, her guidance flawless. And suddenly the city remembered what they tried to dismiss. They were never fighting a girl. They were confronting a legacy in disguise. You, chosen one, carry that same paradox. The less you explained, the more the spirit world recognized you. Because heaven doesn't anoint volume, it anoints veracity. When you speak, it shakes foundations. When you move, disorder flees. You weren't just sent, you were survived. Isaiah 43, 2 promises. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned. The flames shall not consume you. And Romans 8:37 declares, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. You don't just overcome, you emerge reformed. Isn't it something that they were mocking what heaven already marked? Could it be that your scars scared them more than any sword you could have raised? They thought they could dominate you, but you were never trying to win in their system. You had already graduated from wars they don't have the stamina to survive. You weren't shaped by flattery, you were shaped by fire, and they're just now realizing that version of you, the one who walked through death and came back without bitterness, that version was never theirs to play with. That version is heaven's to deploy. They called you arrogant, but what they were really feeling was weight. Not the weight of ego, but the weight of alignment. They couldn't name it, so they labeled it. They couldn't match it, so they mocked it. And because your confidence didn't bow, your certainty, didn't stutter, and your voice didn't shake. They projected insecurity and called it discernment. You didn't boast. You didn't demand attention. You just didn't shrink. You walked in rooms like someone who had already wrestled with doubt and won. That kind of authority unsettles those who have only ever known affirmation by applause. You weren't being arrogant. You were being whole. What if the resistance you faced wasn't because of your volume, but because of your vibration? What if your stillness sounded like thunder to people whose souls were still fragmented? Luke 4:32 says of Jesus, "They were amazed at his teaching because his message had authority." He didn't speak more loudly than the Pharisees. He spoke with more weight. So do you. And that's what made people uncomfortable. They thought you were competing, but you weren't playing their game. You were enforcing a frequency. You weren't walking in pride. You were walking in permission. Real authority, the kind that shifts atmospheres and provokes silent conviction, doesn't require titles. It's not handed down from institutions. It's born in the wilderness, crafted in solitude, tested in silence, and you, chosen one, paid for it. Creation itself affirms this. A lion doesn't roar for approval. It moves quietly, and the land yields. You are that lion. You don't puff your chest. You carry a calm so dense it unnerves the unanchored. Look at Angela Bassett, a woman who never had to scream to be seen. Her presence commands. Her tone heals and convicts at once. Her power isn't in her pitch, it's in her poise. That's not arrogance. That's alignment born through decades of discipline. Now contrast that with Carlos Ghosn, the once celebrated CEO of Nissan and Renault. He was praised as a corporate savior, hailed for turning companies around and expanding global empires. But behind the accolades was a man entangled in greed, secrecy, and self-preservation. The world applauded his rise until heaven exposed the rot. He was arrested for financial misconduct, accused of using company funds for personal luxury. And instead of facing accountability, he fled justice, hiding in shadows. That's what happens when someone carries position, but not purity. When you try to wield influence without inner alignment, the realm doesn't stay silent. He didn't fall because someone cursed him. He fell because spiritual law doesn't honor image over integrity. In a small town named Werent, a teacher named Zale never raised his voice. Yet every rebellious student grew silent when he entered the room, not from fear, but from reverence. One principal accused him of being too proud for refusing to change his ways. But a decade later, all 5 of that principal's successors had children mentored by Zale. Not one of them ever called him arrogant again. They finally understood. You can't recognize authority when your spirit still bows to performance. You weren't trying to steal attention. You were born carrying light. You didn't ask to be different. You just stopped apologizing for it. And when you stopped shrinking, people's illusions began to crumble. 2 Corinthians 10:18 reminds us, "For it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends." You weren't seeking approval. You were responding to assignment. You were commissioned, not crowned. Could it be that your presence offended their performance? Isn't it wild how your identity, carved through surrender, became a mirror they couldn't survive looking into? They weren't reacting to arrogance. They were recoiling from truth. And that truth wasn't even loud. It was just undeniable. You didn't come to be praised. You came to pierce the veil of ego. You didn't show up to dominate. But heaven made sure your presence would disrupt everything built on false foundations. You weren't arrogant. You were just done apologizing for being awakened. They thought they were brilliant, calculated, clever. They moved like shadow players, whispering in the dark, convinced they had cornered you without your knowing. Like puppet masters pulling strings behind the scenes, they mistook your silence for ignorance and your calm for confusion. But what they didn't realize was chilling. They were trying to play chess with a being who already knew the entire map of eternity. While they obsessed over pawns and traps, you were seated beside the one who authored the very rules of the game. You weren't scrambling, you were discerning. Every pause was on purpose, every silence was strategy. Because when your moves are ordered by the creator of time, you're not responding to earthly chaos. You're flowing with heaven's choreography. They saw stillness, but heaven saw precision. What they interpreted as hesitation was really synchronization. You weren't behind, you were beyond. What if your quiet confidence wasn't about being one step ahead, but 10 dimensions above their understanding? What if the reason you never reacted was because you already saw how their play would end? Jesus didn't flinch when Judas leaned in to kiss him. He didn't interrupt the Last Supper to call him out, didn't plead with Peter to stop the betrayal, didn't dodge the cross, because he knew the betrayal was part of the blueprint. Luke 22:21 says, "But behold, the hand of him who betrays me is with me on the table." He was never blind to the game, he was simply above it. And so were you. They mistook the chessboard for a battlefield and thought they were the generals, but they didn't realize you were receiving intelligence from the throne room. You moved with prophetic foresight. You knew who was smiling falsely. You could feel the fake praise. You saw the cracks before the collapse. You watched them plot, dig pits, whisper lies, and you let them. Why? Because in the spirit, you already knew they'd fall into the very hole they dug. Proverbs 26:27 makes it plain. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them. That's what happens when your strategy is submission and your vision comes from communion. You didn't react because heaven already responded. The wild was designed to echo this wisdom. The owl does not flap wildly in the face of a predator. It turns its head silently, seeing in the dark what others miss in the light. The wolf does not growl at every threat. It tracks, it watches, it waits. And when it moves, the entire pack moves with it. Your wisdom was the kind that moves in stillness, but commands realms. Your stillness wasn't silence, it was surveillance. Chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov, one of the greatest to ever play. What made him elite wasn't just his skill, it was his vision. He could see 10 to 15 moves ahead and sense patterns his opponents didn't notice. When asked about his secret, he said, "The real secret of a chess master is his ability to see invisible threats." That's what you've done. You didn't need to expose their moves. You discerned the entire pattern and chose when and whether to respond. Sungri, a global pop star turned businessman, seemed to be playing the industry with charm, strategy, and success. One modern example of this is Sungri, whose rise was as rapid as his downfall was devastating. While many believed he was simply navigating fame with brilliance, behind the scenes he was orchestrating a network of exploitation, cover-ups, and abuse of power. What looked like confidence was, in reality, concealment. When the veil was finally torn, it wasn't a rival that ended his reign. It was exposure, not a legal opponent, but spiritual backlash. Because when you attempt to bend reality around ego and ignore the realm that watches in silence, the collapse comes not by sword, but by truth. And truth, once released, doesn't ask permission to rearrange everything. Meanwhile, in a quiet mountain village in Andalusia, a woman named Mirella owned a small olive grove. She was ridiculed for refusing to sell her land to a foreign investor promising riches. They mocked her old ways and even tried to spread rumors that she was mentally unfit. But she said little, kept harvesting, kept praying. Years later, a drought hit the entire region, except her grove. Why? She'd spent years cultivating a hidden irrigation system underground, unknown to anyone. The very woman they mocked ended up supplying the town's only oil harvest that year. Her wisdom wasn't reactionary, it was prophetic. Chosen one, this has been your rhythm all along. While they were watching the board, you were listening to the architect. While they were reacting to moves, you were following eternal timing. You weren't just protected, you were pre-informed. Every betrayal triggered an upgrade. Every setback, a divine reroute. Every time they thought they had you in checkmate, God changed the rules mid-game. You weren't walking with calculation, you were walking in covenant. That's why it didn't matter how smart they thought they were. Your assignment outranked their intellect. Their ego was never a match for your anointing. And now the board has flipped. The trap has turned. The ones who thought they had you boxed in are now boxed out. Because the player they underestimated wasn't playing alone. You were seated at the table with the king. And when you play with the king, checkmate belongs to heaven. At first they didn't flinch. You seemed too still, too quiet, too unimpressive by worldly standards. You didn't walk with an entourage. You didn't defend yourself when falsely accused. You didn't announce your assignment, and because your presence was wrapped in restraint, they mistook it for irrelevance. But what they couldn't see was what surrounded you, what covered you, what walked beside you. They thought they were confronting a person, but what they touched was a protocol, a heavenly mantle, a realm, and now they fear you. Not because you threatened them, but because the air changed when they tried. What if the very silence they mocked became the silence that haunts them now? What if your calm wasn't absence but divine insulation? You were never unprotected. You were just hidden. Hidden like Moses in the reeds before his time. Hidden like David among the sheepfolds before the crown. Hidden like Jesus growing in favor and wisdom before his first miracle. They didn't recognize the hiding as preparation. They read it as weakness. Isaiah 54:17 declares, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you in judgment you shall condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord." You didn't even need to speak. Heaven already issued the verdict. And now the results speak louder than your response ever could. Doors are closing for them. Rest is fleeing. People are leaving their side without explanation. Truths they buried are bubbling up from places they forgot they buried them. The judgment wasn't loud. It was layered, delayed only long enough for repentance. But now it's visible. Nature understands what they didn't. The pufferfish doesn't expand because it wants to fight. It expands because something crossed a line. The porcupine doesn't launch an attack. It simply carries consequence. And the same spirit that encircles you responds without command. Not because you are vengeful, but because you are sacred. Malcolm X, a once silenced radical, became the voice of a movement not by volume, but by conviction. For years he was watched, mocked, misquoted, but his discipline, his focus, his spiritual clarity made people tremble. Because when a person walks in purpose, even their restraint can echo louder than speeches. In contrast, Elizabeth Finch, a once respected professor and writer, fabricated years of her personal life, claiming to battle cancer, abuse, and trauma, to gain sympathy and credibility in her academic and professional circles. Her stories moved colleagues, won her influence, and placed her in powerful rooms. But the truth unraveled when her ex-husband revealed the deception. Her platform vanished. Institutions distanced themselves. Her own words became evidence against her. She didn't collapse because someone cursed her. She collapsed because she trespassed emotional sacred ground, weaponizing compassion to manipulate reality. And when you exploit pain for power, you're not just deceiving people, you're defying the spiritual laws of truth. And those laws respond in silence, then in storm. Somewhere in Morocco, a quiet seamstress named Amira stitched prayers into every hem she crafted. She never advertised, never shouted her story, but when a wealthy merchant tried to underpay her and steal her designs, strange things began to happen. His shipments failed, his warehouse flooded, his license was revoked. No one could explain it, except Amira, who simply whispered, "I am protected." She wasn't feared because she fought. She was feared because heaven answered on her behalf. You too have been answered, not with lightning, but with divine shifts. They pushed you, but couldn't move you. They cursed you, but couldn't stop you. And now they whisper your name differently, cautiously, carefully, because something in their spirit recognizes what their ego ignored. You're not alone. You never were. Psalm 91:11 reminds us, "For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways." You weren't guarded because you asked. You were guarded because you were chosen. And that kind of backing isn't earned, it's inherited through fire. They judged you by volume, but they didn't discern vibration. You weren't broadcasting power. You were vibrating with it. And the spiritual realm they trespassed into now follows them like shadow. They mocked your stillness, but now they're rattled by it, because it wasn't silence, it was weight. It was holy protocol. The same reason the priests couldn't just walk into the Holy of Holies uninvited. There are consequences for approaching sacred things casually. They were unprepared for the cost of dishonoring covenant. They thought they could poke the ark and walk away whole, but now they tremble, not at your hand, but at the hand that holds you. You didn't rise to intimidate, you rose because you were assigned, and with that assignment came armor, not made of metal, but of mantle. You were refined in the dark, shaped in rejection, baptized in betrayal, and now that you walk in that quiet authority, you don't need a platform. Your life preaches. Your silence terrifies more than their screaming ever could, because silence like yours is never empty. It's echoing with the voice of heaven. So now you know. Their attack didn't break you, it revealed you. It wasn't random, it was a divine trigger. And what it unlocked wasn't revenge, but recognition. The truth is, the very thing they meant to discredit you exposed your spiritual clearance. What they didn't understand is that rank in the spirit can't be faked, and it surely can't be revoked by slander. You didn't ask to be elevated, you just refused to bow, and that was enough for heaven to respond. What does this mean for you now? It means you've entered the season where your authority speaks before you do. It means your silence has been louder than their noise. It means your alignment has outranked their agenda. And above all, it means you're not just covered, you're called, not just chosen, you're commissioned. So if this message stirred something deep in your spirit, if it confirmed the very battles you've been fighting in private, don't leave without anchoring your presence here. Like this video, so the word keeps reaching those it's meant for. Comment below with your thoughts, your testimony, or simply drop a if you felt your rank unlock. Share this with someone who's been doubting their worth because of an invisible war. They need this reminder of who they are. And subscribe to the channel, because this is more than just a platform. It's a sanctuary, a sacred meeting ground for God's chosen ones who are done hiding, done shrinking, and ready to walk in the full stature of who heaven says they are. To every soul who supported this space, whether through a super thanks, a silent prayer, or just showing up, thank you from the depths of this calling. Your presence matters, your alignment is seen, and your agreement with truth helps this message go further than any algorithm ever could. You didn't just survive their attack, you ascended through it. Now go forward boldly. Your rank has been revealed and the realm has been notified. God bless you, keep you, and continue to crown your obedience with divine recompense. See you in the next word. You're not alone. You're positioned, you're protected, and you are finally being recognized for what you always carried.